Yo, what's going on, everybody? Peace, Hotep, all that good stuff, Black Power, all of that. Hello. Um, Welcome to another edition of House of I-10. You're here with us on Sunday, July 10th. We just gonna have a little build. It's been a minute since I've been on here, but every time I get on here and record, I'm always so happy, and just, really proud of myself, pat myself on the back a little bit for stepping out of my comfort zone and just doing something I've always wanted to do, but maybe necessarily didn't always have the courage to do. So I'm here, and today we're going to talk about debunking the myths of racist ideologies. We're going to have a little segment exploring the history of racism, the history of inferiority versus superiority. We're just going to have a real good build on that. I really think it's important for us to kind of peel back the layers of some of these ideologies that manifest themselves in our society, in our community, because it's tearing us apart instead of building and bringing us together. So I always want to, I like to look at history because I'm trying to find a place of understanding. And so I'm always trying to figure out ways of how we can connect each other, to have better outcomes, better partnerships, better relationships. And so, unfortunately, to do that, we may have to explore some conversations that may make us feel uncomfortable, which I heard a long time ago. And I'm not going to say that I was the creator of it, but the term courageous conversations, ever since I heard about that, I've always been so encouraged to be willing to have tough conversations, but those tough conversations have to come from a place of love, a place of from understanding, and trying to impart knowledge and wisdom so that we can have better feelings about ourselves, or really know what we need to, maybe like what we need to give value to, and then what we don't. And so racism, as we all know, it's just is really has divided us as a people and been a contributor to mental issues within our community. And I think that all comes because we hear about it, we're able to point it out, we're able to detail it, but we don't really understand why it manifests itself. And then for those who choose to think in that light, I want you to be able to, at least if you're going to be a racist, if you're going to have those type of ideas and feel a certain type of way about people, I want you to come from a place of knowledge to know, here are the concepts that were created. Here's who created them, and here's the science that was behind this particular idea about you being better than another group of people. Because a lot of us, we're doing out of ignorance, and it was just passed down, but we don't know why it was passed down, and we don't know what was the authentic record, and who was the person that coined these certain ideologies and ideas. So we're going to explore all of that. um, and I think that that's going to give us better concepts so that we can take history and can connect it to today. I always say that history is important because it helps us understand how events in the past connect to the ways of the world today. When you fail to understand history, then you are susceptible to repeat the same mistakes and pitfalls of our ancestors. But when you try to understand history and begin in the middle of the story, your frame of reference is compromised because you could be researching from the period of misinformation or the point of indoctrination. So with that, it's like, you can, for us, right, as Black people, African Americans, I'll tell you this before I go in, I'm a Pan-African. That we are not a monolith, and there are so many unique perspectives and cultures that we kind of come from. And so I don't subscribe to one specific type of thinking, but if I had to kind of subject myself or claim something, I'm definitely going to be a Pan-African. So if you are of that descent and you're in the diaspora out there in the world, I'm with you, as long as you're doing something positive, as long as you're trying to impact the community around you, and you're trying to impact the people to help them get closer to whatever ideology, or if you're trying to even explore different ideologies and debate those and figure out what the merits are, so that it is get us closer to a line of thinking that further pushes us and progresses us forward. So I'm with that. But I'll say when you start history in the middle, if we take African American history, right, and we start that in slavery or from slavery, then you're always going to have a bar that you're going to judge your sense of progress based off of that standard of slavery. So we'll have this false idea that we're in a great state, we're good, we'll have a sense of complacency because you're going to say, at least we're not in slavery. At least we have voting rights. At least we have civil rights. And you'll never have this ambition and drive to go way far beyond that. So when you look at our history and you take it back to before colonialism and before slavery, and now you start to look at, who were we in Africa? When we had our own tribes or when we were united. And I'm not saying that all Africans on the continent were united. We all had different tribes. We all had different beliefs, but some of the concepts, the spiritual concepts, the connectivity that existed in those individual tribes are far better than where we are today as a people. And so if I had to, I say essentially my tribe would be Africans in America, right? I mean, you still got Jamaicans, you got Haitians, that are other places in the diaspora. But here, I'm going to try to connect and figure out a culture and associate with the culture here in America with my fellow African Americans. And so when I do that, that's essentially is what I mean as far as my tribe. So when you look historically and you look at what they were doing in Kemet, I think I already talked about this before, Egypt. That's not the original name of it. So we're going to deal with original names here. So even with Africa, Al-Kebulon and whatever else, I'm saying, those names that came before. But when you're looking at what was going on in Kemet, and then now you start to measure yourself based off what they were doing back then, it will cause you to want to ascend to higher heights. And that's the goal. We got to look beyond this 400 years of slavery. And we got to go beyond that and look at the 3,000 years, 4,000 years of existence when we as Africans of the diaspora were in our communities and when we were flourishing. And I know some people may be thinking, well, yeah, but Kemet had slaves. And I want to go ahead and debunk that, because here's the way that you know that it's not true. Slave is a Middle English terminology. So let's go ahead, let's pull up the dictionary real quick. So when you look at the origins of the word slave, you will see that it was first recorded in 1250 to 1300. It's Middle English, Slav, from Old French esclave, and medieval Latin sclavis, masculine, or sklava for feminine. Slave, special use of Slavis, Slavic, a Slav slave. And it's so called because Slavs in Central Europe and the Balkans were commonly enslaved in the Middle Ages. See origin at Slav. So slave didn't come until 1250 or 1300. So when you're talking about Kemet, you're talking about 3000 BC. So the word wasn't even in existence. So the word wasn't in existence. And in the original language, in the Medu Neter, you don't have a word for slave in the same sense as to the slavery we experience today, or we experience, in the 1600s, 1500s, 1400s, and beyond. So it just says, for the definition real quick, a person who is the property of and wholly subject to another and forced to provide unpaid labor. So let's just go ahead, and for anybody who's thinking about this, the Hebrews being enslaved in Egypt, let's go ahead and get that out of our minds already and debunk that. That was not a terminology that was used. Therefore, that type of situation did not exist. And so, what it was about in Egypt or in Africa, everybody wasn't kings and queens or pharaohs and queens like that. Everybody wasn't that. So I don't want to romanticize history and then seem that that's what it was, because what made that community stronger was that you had willing participants. You had people who were willing to play their role and affect their community around them, and they were on board with that. And so if we start to if we start to adopt that type of ideology here, and we work together, and somebody or a group of families or whatever were elevated and were doing the right thing or a great thing and was leading the nation and leading the people, that's fine, and we have to be okay with that. We have to understand to be good with that. So that's what we're trying to get to. And I will also say the other important thing about history is that when you learn history, the same trickery can't be used to subject and oppress the new generation that's under whatever regime. My mom used to always tell me that. She used to say, it's the same game, it's just different players. And so that's all you have is a cyclical revolution of what's going on with societies where you have somebody's on top and then somebody's subjugated. Well, we don't have to make the same mistakes as our ancestors did. And when you read the history, you can learn from that. And if somebody is trying to do something to you to put you in those same conditions, you can see their game from a mile away, because I say game recognized game. And so because you're studied and learned in the ways of the history and the ways of what happened before, when they try to invoke them same actions on you or whatever, whatever you want to call it, it's not going to work. And it ain't going to work over here. So that's why I want to kind of explore this conversation. And, we have to get into it real quick. So here you go. You can see, as I said, we're going to talk about debunking the myth of racist ideologies. And let me go and start the slideshow for you. And I'm going to kind of jump around. This is part of a 92 slide PowerPoint that I have. So, I'm just kind of get to it and may not go in order, but we're going to explore these things that are relevant to the conversation. So the concept of race, I'm not saying this is the first person necessarily, but I'm saying these are the people who played a significant role. So you got 1684, French physician Francois Bernier was the first to attempt to categorize people by geographical origin and physical differences, dividing them into 4 races. Then you have the father of anthropology, who was Samuel George Morton. You got Crania Americana, which is the most influential book on scientific racism. That's by Carl Linnaeus. And that was based on a study of skull sizes, where he promoted white supremacy and intellectual hierarchy. It was determined that this is the science behind it. It was determined that the bigger the skull, the smarter you were. And he disregarded age, sex, health, and body size. Again, pay attention to that sentence. We're going to elaborate on that though. But it said it was determined that the bigger the skull, the smarter you were. And then the Charleston Medical Journal in 1851 wrote, we can only say that we of the South should consider him as our benefactor for aiding most materially in giving to the Negro his true position as an inferior race. So the flawed science of Samuel Morton. This guy, known as the father of anthropology, he published Crania Americana, which is Philadelphia's, had access to Philadelphia's Academy of Natural Sciences, which hosted the largest collection of human skulls. With access to these skulls, he measured 100 of the varying skull species in cubic inches. Only 100. 100 skulls to represent the entire world is what he used. That was his science. That's what he used to measure and determine the superiority and inferiority of a people. Keep that in mind. His flawed assumption was the bigger the skull, the bigger the intellect of the person. And he also published a writing entitled Crania Egyptica and concluded Egypt was historically a land of Caucasian rulers, Hebrews, and you guessed it, Blacks were as slaves. And you'll see 2 things that I use as far as my sources, and we will probably check out one of these sources. But people always ask me, well, where can I start at as far as learning history? And so I put those sources in here so at least you'll have some frame of reference. So you'll see page 180 stamped from the beginning. They explore, this is in Ibram Kendi's book. And so he'll explore Samuel Morton and kind of elaborate on how that ideology played into the subjugation of black people. And so let's go up. What's crazy is this man didn't look at brain. He didn't look at levels of intelligence to work or formulate problems, problem solve, none of that. What he did was just look at the outer shell of bone to then just determine that you were either smart or that you were dumb. And this guy is known as the father of anthropology for us in the United States. And he had a slew of collections of papers, and people were following this ideology. This is one case of the science that was used. I put the air quotations, the science that was used to determine that Black people were inferior to white people. And so let's see what happens. If we click on this link, let me go ahead and make sure that we all see it. So this is Learning for Justice, how Samuel Morton got it wrong. And this pretty much, this article just explores more of what his MO was for doing this particular experiment. And so you see his measurements showed that modern Caucasian skulls had the highest volume, followed by Chinese skulls. American Indian skulls had the lowest volume, and Morton found that the volume of African skulls were third in line above the South Asians and American Indians. His skull measurements were used to justify the institution of chattel slavery in the United States. If Africans were not of the same species as Caucasians, then enslaving them was more easily explained and excused. Indeed, this belief supported the reasoning of Justice Roger B. Taney in the Dred Scott decision of 1857. And so we're going to see how this particular method of thinking then impacts, we're going to see how this method of thinking impacts the conditions that a group of people had to live in for hundreds of years. And then even how that still rolls and festers itself today. So next, we're going to move on and we're going to go to, I think this is, so we're going to go to Egyptology. Remember, we talked about Egyptology a little bit when he wrote Carnea Egyptica. And so Egyptology was essentially created to whitewash the land of Egypt. So all the pyramids, the temples, the structures, all of that was really Black in origin. Egyptology was created to start to erase that. And they also use Egyptology researchers to kind of go over there. And that's why you have so many artifacts that are over in the museum over in Britain. Not too long ago, I came back from Paris. I went to the Louvre. I went straight to the section about Egypt. They got a vast section on ancient Egypt and of coffins, of just all types of things, statues. And Egyptology was the area of study that was used and able to extract those things from out of the original land and original peoples, and then start to recreate and redefine who the people of Egypt were, because they had to take out the intellectual advancements in association with Africans, because there's no way at the same time they can call us inferior and say that we're not smart and say that we have intellectual deficiencies, but then also associate us with some of the largest marvels of the world. And so there's a gentleman named Champollion, who you can look at. I have him in one of my books. It's up here. Now Valued Contributions to Civilization, an amazing book by Dr. Anthony Browder. But they talk about Champollion and how he was just saying that it's crazy how the people that we're subjugating and enslaving, this is his quote, the people we're subjugating and enslaving were the ones who built this magnificence that's tied to astronomy and astrology and mathematics, and of course science. So that was the whole point, is why they're trying to turn us away from looking back at Africa, why they're trying to take Egypt out of Africa and put it in the quote unquote Middle East. Mind you, I just learned this too. So the way that you got to turn the Middle East, the only way it could be the Middle East is if the frame of reference comes from Europe. So if Europe is at the center of the world, then now everything else is judged by that particular location. So that's how you get the terminology of something being classified as Middle East. Middle East, as I say, if you want to make sense about that, show me where the Middle South is, the Middle North, and the Middle West. You never heard those terminologies. So all of this is tied to the field of Egyptology, and it's tied to reshaping where, the world, or where civilization, advanced civilization, existed. So real quick, when we're talking about this too, when I say we have to stop giving so much, we have to stop giving so much of our frame of reference to slavery. That was 400. Well, let's do this. Let's include, if we include the sub-Saharan slave trade, that was about 1,400 to 2,000 years of our people being oppressed, or, losing our frame, our way of life, our culture. It was about 2,000 years that we experienced that. But for at least 4,000 years before we ever went into that condition, and mind you, most of us here in America, we only deal with the transatlantic slave trade. We don't even talk about sub-Saharan slave trade and the enslavement of the Arabs did. So we 400 years, but we're just totally erasing or not even paying attention to 4,000 years of a civilization. And then on top of that, when you have conversations about some other things, we got to remember Homo sapiens sapiens, what they say that we kind of derive from, that's about 12,000 years of an existence. But if you look at Homo sapiens, there is anthropologist named Richard Leakey, right? And so he had discovered in the Omo River in Ethiopia in 1967, some, bones in these partial skulls. Well, they were carbon dated to go back at least to 195,000 years ago. And they had believed that these particular human skulls, which was the start of civilization, started and existed in East Africa. So, but then a couple years later in 2017, there were some fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, and that included skull, face, and jaw bones, and they were firmly identified as Homo sapiens. They dated to 315,000 years ago. So the history is just vast, and there were, and during that time, that was Africa. Morocco is in Africa, and of course, Leakey's was in East Africa. So you're talking about our people having a long lineage of creations, establishing civilizations, and the reason why we deal with Egypt is not because it was the first civilization, but it is one of the most well-documented civilizations. But when you start to even delve into that, the people of Kemet will tell you that their ancestors came from the South. And so, when you start talking about where did civilization possibly even start at, you got to be talking about maybe Central Africa to South Africa. It's all theory, but I'm saying all that to say, we got to look beyond this narrative of the last 400 years. But let me get back on track. So you had George R. Gladen, who was an American-born Egyptologist. He was a follower of Samuel Morton, and he used to tour around the country lecturing on the marvels of Egypt. He also later concluded that Egyptians were of Caucasian descent. And when Morton produced his works, Gladen concluded that this proves, mind you, we still talking about the measure of a skull now, but this proves Negro races had always been servants and slaves, always subjected to the Caucasian in the remotest of times. And so you see this picture on the left, drawings from Josiah Knott and George Glenden's Indigenous Races of the Earth, which promoted the scientific racism with the suggestion that Black people ranked between white people and chimpanzees in terms of intelligence. It's not science, y'all. So next we're gonna go we're gonna push on to Carl Linnaeus. And so he had a published work that was called System Naturalis. Hold on one second. So this was a time where it was a classification of all living things into kingdoms, classes, orders, genera, and species. He grouped humans into 4 types by their continent of origin. So at the time, you had like what's famously known as the 4 corners of the earth. And that essentially, we're talking about Europe, Asia, America, and Africa. But in this particular work, the Africans were deemed lazy, sluggish, neglectful, and governed by caprice to imply inferiority. Next, you had philosopher David Hume in a footnote of his 1753 essay of National Characters asserted his belief that Negroes were naturally inferior to whites and that there was no civilized nation of any other complexion than white. Don't forget, I am giving you origins. I'm giving you the sources and the foundation of how racism was created. So you can look at the years that we're talking about to really see like how this started to really turn, and you can look at the people. And that way, once you see these names and once you see what their thought process, what their methodology was, you can figure out how asinine it is to classify yourself as being superior to somebody else, and this being the science that was back behind it. So during the American Revolution, a full-blown debate in the European world erupted on the origins of humans. Immanuel Kant lectured on the rule of Buffon, that all humans were one species from the same natural genius. Europe was the cradle of humanity where man must have departed from original formation. The inhabitant of Europe had a more beautiful body, works harder, is more jocular, more controlled in his passions, more intelligent than any other race of people in the world. He further stated that humanity is at its greatest perfection in the race of whites. This is also from out of Ibram Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning. And so they're having these debates in the European world to start to create a narrative that differentiates white people from Black people. That's just only people that's a part of this discussion though is white people. Because of course, we know that during the American Revolution, what the condition of slavery was. And so at the time, they were having to deal with the moral, because they're trying to create a democracy. But how can you create a democracy and say all men are created equal, but then you have a group of men who and women and people who are in those particular conditions, and you're the ones that are keeping your foot on their necks. You're the ones that's creating this environment to sustain this particular condition. So they have to create more buy-in. They have to create these narratives because at the time too, the droves of people that was living in America were not literate, right? So they're just taking word of mouth. They're taking these people at what face value and what they're saying, and then they're starting to become indoctrinated and they're starting to teach this. And mind you, at the same time too, we have to understand that because we're still in 1753, so we haven't even got to January 1st, 1808, once it became illegal for you to import enslaved people from outside of the country. So when you're having the children growing up, they're teaching the children, I'm talking about the African children who are become African Americans, now first generation born, they're teaching those children these particular narratives too. So now the kids who don't know anything, right? They come, their brain is just a blank slate. They're starting to learn these things about themselves, but then they're also starting to learn these things about the people who are ruling and controlling them and giving them the governing of the day. So that is the indoctrination. Once you indoctrinate me as a child and it's all I know, when I grow up and I become an adult, that's all I'm going to know. I will have feelings within myself that will kind of go against that and, say like something isn't right about this, but I won't be able to articulate and put my finger on it because you're also teaching me the language. And also around me, I'm in this bubble. So I'm in the echo chambers where other people feel this way too. And so then once I have children, I begin to teach them that even if I innately feel like something is wrong, I'm also trying to teach them because I'm thinking about survival. I'm thinking about their better interests. So I may tell them things not because I may subscribe to the inferiority, because I'm battling right now, I'm battling with higher self and lower self, but I'm gonna tell those things to protect them because I know that this is the order of the day, and I know that this is how the rules of engagement are. So let's keep going. Violence. Well, violence and let me go to Carl Linnaeus. I'm gonna come back to this one. So also Carl Linnaeus. So Systema Naturae was edited 12 times in Linnaeus's life. As each edition was amended, corrected, and augmented, Systema Naturae grew in scope and content. For the first 9 editions, Linnaeus' classification of man remained stable. Mind you, he didn't have all of these extras about the differences between people. This started to occur as he created more and more editions, and he's starting to rewrite the science to fit the order of the day and the preferences of what government, medical society, what everybody wants it to say. So now you're starting to see Linnaeus's class, or it says remain stable, with the human species divided into 4 types or varieties, as he called them in Latin. And here was the different types. You had, Eurapus albus, which was the European white, Americanus rubescens, American reddish, which is probably the so-called Indian, which, you know, the reason why they call Native Americans, indigenous people, Indians, was because Christopher Columbus, when he was sailing and he landed on this particular area, he was originally trying to go to India, so he thought this was India, so that's why he called them Indians. So the Asiaticus fuscus, the Asian tawny, and then the Africanus niger, which was the African black. Now let me go and share another screen real quick so we can explore and we can see the chart for Linnaeus. Let's go here. And here we go. So now here's the chart. And so in this, you see him starting to write these observations about the different people. And we're gonna go to Africanus. So dark hair with many twisting braids, silky skin, flat nose, swollen lips, women with elongated labia, breasts lactating profusely, sly, sluggish, neglectful, anoints himself with fat, and he's governed by choice. So governed by like caprice, like greed. But you see let's go to the Eurapus, or Eurapus, Europaeus, and it says plenty of yellow hair, blue eyes, light, wise, an inventor, protected by tight clothing and governed by rights. So he's not primitive. He has a social order that governs him, essentially like a culture and a moral way of life is pretty much what they're trying to say. And then he has the Americanus, red, choleric, straight hair, straight, black and thick hair, gaping nostrils, freckle face, bearded chin, unyielding, cheerful, free, paints himself in a maze of red lines, governed by customary right. And so we see that he's breaking things down into skin color, medical temperament, physical traits relating to hair color and form, eye color, distinctive facial traits, behavior, manner of clothing, form of government. So this is what he's using to observe, but you have to really sit back and ask, what was the authenticity in this particular study? How long did you study these people? Did you study these people outside of their natural environment? What conditions were they put into when you were studying them to determine this? And then, of course, the implicit biasness, and as you being a science, were you able to be objective? All of these questions go unanswered within this quote unquote research that we are using to determine, again, if a peoples are inferior to another people. Mind you, we got thousands and thousands of years of history and millions of people at the time, but what is your sample size? All questions that you have to ask when you try to determine if this science is valid and if we are at a proper conclusion. All right, let's get back to the PowerPoint. And so next we get to David Hume. Now remember, David Hume, he was also a philosopher as well. And you can see in the footnote of his 1753, I should say, essay of National Characters, he asserted his belief that Negroes were naturally inferior to whites and that there was no civilized nation of any other complexion than that of white. And so now we move on, so we can see the scientists, we see the philosophers, and now we finna get into government to see how government, so all of these narratives are being created in all these different arenas so that the web becomes woven. And so you have pro-slavery substantiated by politics and academics. So Senator John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, mind you, got a lot of people. I just picked this one, but if you could bring up Andrew Jackson, you can bring up Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. You can bring up a nice group of men. I would call the institution, because that institution was created by white men who are substantiating, repeating, and making sure that everybody else is using this particular information to keep the social engineering flourishing. So you have, back to what I was saying, so you have Senator John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, who's one of the most astute and fearless defenders of slavery. This man served as vice president under two presidents, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. On February 6, 1837, he stated that the relation now existing in slaveholding states between the two races is instead of an evil, a good, a positive good. He stated it was both a positive good for society and a positive good for subordinate Black people. He even stated slavery was racial progress. Whig evangelist Calvin Cotton demanded action against anti-slavery and abolition, a sedition, and a voice from America to England in 1839. There is no such thing as equality among men, nor can there be. Neither God nor man ever instituted equality. So unfortunately, during these times, science affirmed these particular views. Joseph Arthur de Gobineau's 1853 essay on the inequality of the human races, he argues that intellectual prowess rendered the white race superior and ranked Black people as at the foot of the ladder, with an intellect that moved in a very narrow circle. He also introduced the toxic idea that the mixing of the races polluted their purity and caused civilizations to decline. In 1950, UNESCO, which is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, declared that racial discrimination was both unscientific and false. So race here, UNESCO, 1950, had determined that racial discrimination was both unscientific and false. Mind you, we know what the conditions was in America in 1950. And we've seen, you see the way that, mind you, this comes out from a respected government-ran organization, and we still have people perpetuating ignorance, right? In a worldwide government type organization. So in 1978, the same entity made up of 193 member states around the world doubled down under the Declaration on Race and Racial Prejudice and stated that all peoples of the world possess equal faculties for attaining the highest level in intellectual, technical, social, economic, cultural, and political development. They further explained that any differences between the achievements of different people are entirely attributable to geographical, historical, political, economic, social, and cultural factors. Look at all of these different factors that go into determining what the different levels of achievements are for a group of people. all of this, and somebody want to talk to me about either my skin color or they want to talk to me about the size of a skull, man, you better get that nonsense up out of here. Like, I'm telling you, if you're going to be racist, I'm going to give you the necessary tools so that you can educate yourself and still be ignorant at the same time. And this is what we have to understand as people. We in our community have to stop having these perpetuating these inferiority concepts, or have to stop playing up what they said about us and trying to give credit to that by going out and acting the way that they said that we used to act, because that we should have been acting. But we have to stop doing that. It's kind of like we shooting our own selves in the foot. It's like we feeding into these particular narratives, and now we starting to adopt these narratives so that they can then be substantiated in what they claim. We got to stop. This is clearly, we see that this way of living that they said about us was not us. Well, you see it now, because I can say you don't know what you don't know, right? So now that you're exposed to this, you kind of gotta G-check yourself and determine, am I living the moral, am I living a life of morality, integrity as I should be living, or am I perpetuating those lies and those stereotypes that they put on us? And am I living the way that they said that we were, when indeed that was not the truth, but they were trying to cultivate an ideology, a false doctrine and a false ideology about us. So let's go on to see how this was in the medical field. Let's talk about the women for a minute. So in 1845, J. Marion Sims, we're gonna talk about what white men did to women in their studies and how that was perpetuated by ignorance. So J. Marion Sims horrifically started experimenting on the vaginas of 11 enslaved women for a procedure to heal a complication of childbirth called vesicovaginal fistula. These experiments to understand this occurrence was done on African enslaved women and with no anesthesia or numbing agents. So they were practicing surgery on African women with no anesthesia, no numbing agents, just going and just cutting them open. One woman went under Sims' knife at least 30 times. Through all of these experiments, Sims did find a way to cure the fistula, and he started providing the necessary medical remedies to heal white women using anesthesia, of course. And he moved to New York and opened the first women's hospital and fathered the American gynecology field. And so remember I said we was going to go back to this other slide. So violence and genealogy, and some of the other things that were happening to women is, hold on. I want to look up something real quick. Let me read this first to you before we go into that. So new evidence of white men's sexual violence against enslaved women is emerging from the genome. A 2020 study sampling the DNA of 50,000 people, 30,000 with African ancestry, reinforced the historical record. Spurred by Joanna Mountain, the senior director of research at 23andMe scientists used DNA in the company's direct-to-consumer database to trace the ancestry of customers whose grandparents were born in one of the regions touched by the transatlantic slave trade. The researchers found that although a majority of the more than 12 million enslaved people who arrived in the Americas were men, enslaved women contributed more to the current gene pool. The genetic contribution of European men to the ancestry of African Americans is 3 times greater than that of European women. What does it mean? This means that enslaved men were more likely to die before they were able to have children, and that enslaved women were often raped by white men and forced to bear their children. So, and the last thing that I'll leave you with, because I said something in the beginning, and I gotta say this, but you can't talk about history by starting in the middle of the story. And so we got to go back a little bit more. I'm about to conclude. I'm about to end on this because I don't want to keep y'all too long. I just want to give you all something that's a starting point for us to have a conversation, at least so you can, so at least that you can educate yourself on what the origins of racism were and how it existed and how it manufactures itself today. But all of this, we was talking about the 1700s, the 1800s, we might have had a 1600 source in there. But all of this came from the Doctrine of Discovery. What was the document? My bad. What was the document or the very thing that started to really push this boat into the water, push this ship into the water, and really got the wind in its sails to then perpetuate what happened throughout the transatlantic slave trade? And that was the Doctrine of Discovery. You have not heard about this before, look it up, read about it, learn about it. The Doctrine of Discovery was a decree giving European kings the right to discover and claim land in non-Christian areas. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V extended this policy through the papal bull, Romanus Pontifex, that declared war against all non-Christians in the world and authorized the conquest of their nations and territories. The decree was based on two beliefs. Christians were the only civilized peoples, and thus they had the right to treat non-Christians as uncivilized and subhuman who had no rights to any land or nation. The second one was the Christians had a God-given right to capture, vanquish, and subdue the Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to put them into perpetual slavery and to take all their possessions and property. See, 1452, look at the timeline. The official decree of the Pope granted permission to King Alfonso V of Portugal. I'm telling you, I'm going to give y'all names. I'm going to give y'all years. I'm going to give y'all the information, the necessary information that you need to connect the dots and to pinpoint exactly where the condition for us as African Americans, where it starts at in this particular land. Now I told you, you got a whole other thing that's going on the continent too beforehand, but this is the part about understanding where we are today and kind of giving you some information that fills in a couple of gaps. So the official decree of the Pope granted permission to King Alfonso V of Portugal to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, who was Muslims, and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, emphasis on ours, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. Lastly, there's still the Doctrine of Discovery. This is Americas and Columbus. I think I spelled his name wrong, but I don't even care about him at all. In the papal bulls, Columbus will be singled out and honored for his efforts to expand the Christian empire. As was pleasing to the Lord, you, Isabella and Ferdinand, with the wish to fulfill your desire, chose our beloved son, Christopher Columbus, a man assuredly worthy and of the highest recommendations and fitted for so great an undertaking. The said Christopher has already caused to be put together and built a fortress fairly equipped, wherein he has stationed as garrison certain Christians, companions of his, who are to make search for other remote and unknown islands and mainlands. They were unknown to these particular people, but of course they already had inhabitants, they already had a culture, they already had a source of spirituality, they already had a diet, they already had structures. But to make search for other remote and unknown islands and mainlands, to bring under your sway the said mainlands and islands with their residents. So there ain't no people there. talking about discovered America. Now it says with their residents and inhabitants, and to bring them to the Catholic faith, to lead the peoples dwelling in those islands and countries to embrace the Christian religion. So now it's telling you they even know that they had a different way of life. They had a different spiritual system, but it was about indoctrinating and bringing them over because they were trying to expand this particular belief system, but they were trying to expand their grips on the empires and landmass so that they can have a larger empire that is subjected under the crown. So to lead the peoples dwelling in those islands and countries to embrace the Christian religion, nor at any time let dangers or hardships deter you therefrom. It's saying have a sense of resilience to continue to see this all the way through to the end of the goal that we set for you, and don't allow anything to sway you or deter you from making this accomplishment to bring these peoples, like they already tell you about the inhabitants and residents, which means that whole discovering was a lie, and they already knew that. But I don't even necessarily know or think that they were coming from a place of thinking that they had discovered America. I think that is what the writers of history that came later, when they started to try to author and when they want to reclassify, that's the phraseology that they began to use. Because even in Christopher Columbus's journal, he tells about the encounters once he got off the boat, or as he was on the ship, and once he got off the boat and stepped foot on the land, he already talks about the people that was there. He even gives a description of them, of the people that were there. So that was just, I think, all a part of the reclassification and indoctrination to try to make it seem like whites and Spaniards were the maritime people of the day, and they were the first to really sail the oceans and all that. But again, falsehoods. But that's how committed they were to seeing this goal of ruling the world and ruling all nations, and then the disregard and disrespect for what other peoples had going on. And they were going to bring them into their world. And it's all to make us follow a certain ideology that continues to put them up on a pedestal, and at the same time turn around on us and make us look down on ourselves. And that's not where we need to be at, because clearly that's not what's working out for us. So the other thing that they do is they erase or they keep certain history from you. Mind you, I found all of this by just opening up books, doing research, the same thing anybody else can do. The only way they're hiding it from you is they're just putting it in the books, and they're hoping that you're going to maintain a intellectual laziness where you won't go looking for it, and they can just feed you doctrine. They can feed you ideals. They can feed you ideologies, and you won't look into it. You just accept it at face value and then do what everybody around you is doing, you know, and that's all because it's a sense of intellectual laziness. So you can just see, like I said, just touching on this particular point, my goal was to debunk racist ideologies. My goal was to show how they put out certain language and falsehoods, misconceptions, misrepresentations of a people, and they crafted these particular ideas and fed it to the rest of the world, and did that through a system of using government policy, which is policy, but the medical field, they reinforced it in the school systems, and then among common folk. And so that's how you began getting this this idea and this whole entire group think of, now we are the ones who have no contribution to civilization, and we need to be civilized. And that was it. That's all I wanted to do. So hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you got something out of this as to where you can go and do your own research. I'll tell you every single time, just because I say it, just because I show it to you on some slides, you got to go look it up and verify it for yourself. But I am never going to hold back the information where you can kind of go and start your own research. So it was great shooting this video. It was great to be back on the scene again. Remember, House of I-10. I got the Twitter page, House of I-10. You know, that's the YouTube as well. Hit me up on houseofi1022@gmail.com. We're going to build, and I'm going to continue doing research and continue bringing y'all these videos. So today we just debunked the racist ideologies to show that ain't made up of no authentic information at all. We might as well just go home and just write our own damn science at this point, because that's how they was living and that's what they was doing. So, you know, continue to become better people, continue to learn more about history so that we can perpetuate excellence in today. And so we can demystify all of the stuff that's going around us, and we can have a better understanding at what our place is in America. And so we can become better versions of ourselves and better versions to other people. So let's climb back to the top. Black power, you know, all of that. Peace, Hotep, however you live in, shalom, all of that. As long as you're doing something that's supposed to further advance Black people, Africans, I'm going to always be with you. We may debate a little bit, go back and forth on ideology, but it's all in the name of intellect. It's all in the name of knowledge, wisdom, understanding. So peace.